So we're here tonight to talk about big data and climate science. In both the public and private sectors, managers rely on timely and comprehensive data to identify emerging risks and opportunities. Climate action is no different, yet traditional sources of climate data provide a limited view of the global climate challenge. They can describe how the climate is changing, but not what solutions would be most effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're joined here today by a distinguished panel representing a diverse set of experiences and perspectives related to using new technologies to benefit actions on climate. I'll turn it over to the panel to introduce themselves. We'll start with Janet.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Janet George. I'm the Chief Data Officer for Western Digital. In the private sector, we are primarily concerned about energy. That's the area we focus on. But today we're going to talk about data and climate, and we're going to also cover the broad area of data for good. So many use cases to share with you later today. But I think that my passion lies with data. I'm actually a practitioner. I pour over very intensive research, lots and lots of it, and then I take that research and I apply it in the industry. So I'm very excited to share with you what I learned through the process of application and also share with you some trends. The two areas that I focus on is things that are for good, positive impact, and then long-term impact and innovative in nature. So that's what I'll be covering.
Good evening. My name is Robert Kirkpatrick. I direct the Global Pulse Initiative in the Secretary General's Office, the UN. I've been in the technology field for about 20 plus years now. Tech startups up in Boston, and one got acquired by Microsoft. Ended up founding a humanitarian assistance team at Microsoft. From there to a Google nonprofit spin-off called Instead in Palo Alto, focused on disaster response and early disease detection, and joined the UN about 7.5 years ago. Here I lead an initiative that is focused on harnessing data science and analytics for sustainable development and humanitarian action. I guess for me, what really motivates me, I mean, my 4-year-old son asked me what I did for a living. And I told him I get to help superheroes find out where people are in trouble so they can rescue them. So data is a big piece of that. So that's why I do what I do.
Got to get a line like that for my son. That's great. I'm Amy Loers. I'm the Director of Climate Change at the Skoll Global Threats Fund. And for those of you who don't know, it's Skoll Global Threats Fund. It was an organization that was started about 7 years ago by Jeff Skoll, who is the first president of eBay. And the vision of starting Skoll Global Threats was to invest in innovation around global threats. And we work on 4 global threats: pandemics, nuclear proliferation, water insecurity, and climate change. And I have overseen the water and climate work. And what we do there is we focus on these threats exploring 4 different levers of innovation. One is around data, one is around science, the other is around public engagement, and then the 4th is around governance, or what we sometimes call novel networks. And what we've found in this, in our work over the last 7 years, I've only been there for about 5, is that it's not any one of those levers alone that can really make the transformable change, but it's actually working on multiple angles at the same time. And getting to the line of sort of what makes me passionate about this, it is at that intersection. I've worked on climate, I'm trained as a climate scientist, and have worked on climate change and sustainability issues for over 20 years. And I've worked at this in different sectors: private sector, government, philanthropy, civil society, and academia. And the reason I keep jumping around is I realize no one of these institutions can actually solve these problems. And the message I really want to give here today is that it is at the intersection. And the reason I'm so excited about data scientists is because data scientists know how to scale things. They know how to scale things the way scientists actually don't. And my scientist friends will be mad at me for saying that, but it's true. And we can have this intersection of working together where we can really solve big problems. And we're facing big problems with climate change.
So I'd first like to start about talking about where we are today with data analytics and applying it to social good. My first question is for Robert. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the current reality of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals.
You may know that in 2015, 193 countries ratified what's called the 2030 Agenda, which is a complex set of targets for people, prosperity, and planet. So this means essentially it's the first framework for achieving economic, social, and environmental progress without accepting compromise, without accepting a trade-off of one to achieve the other. That's a pretty disruptive approach because history, since time immemorial, has always made these trade-offs. We created jobs, but we cut down the forest. It's a very challenging set of targets. We've got 17 goals, 169 actual targets within those, and 230 indicators for measuring progress. And it's pretty radical in what it's attempting to do. This isn't about reducing poverty, reducing hunger, reducing carbon emissions. It's about eliminating them. I don't know how many of you grew up watching Star Trek, but like this is actually a kind of transformational agenda, and that means we need massive innovation. One of the challenges, of course, with the SDGs is that it's not just challenging to change society so that we can live our lives this way. It's also challenging because we live in an increasingly complex world, right? The pace of change is accelerating because of hyperconnectivity. There are innovations that are causing havoc as well as creating opportunities that arise so quickly people don't even realize that they're there until they've happened. And so there's a huge need for better, faster information in general. Global Pulse came out of that overall challenge and opportunity. We were created during the financial crisis back in 2009, saying, 3 to 5 year old household level statistics just don't cut it anymore. We need real-time information. Actually, we really need prediction for us to be agile enough to make sure that we're able to protect vulnerable populations from harm. And so the Sustainable Development Goals are an incredible opportunity, but they're going to require very different ways of making decisions, right? Serious epistemological challenges here. And this is really where I think the opportunities for data science and analytics come in. We've been for some time saying, this isn't just about using new data to measure progress on these goals. This is really about changing how we implement the work that is done all around the world. It's about changing daily decisions so that you can see risks as they emerge. I think when we look at the sort of traditional world, most of the data needed to achieve progress in the past was collected, owned, and used by governments. Today, most of it's produced by people without their knowledge, collected by machines, and owned by corporations. So it's a very fragmented landscape. If we can bring the insights to bear on these very pressing problems and change how we operate, we can do a lot of good. So we've had examples about like smart cities, and that's an area where people are pretty familiar with sort of public good applications of big data. Understanding where the traffic jams are, understanding how much pollution people are exposed to and how much we produce. When do emergency calls come in, where do the ambulances need to be, these kinds of things. We've been doing some work, for example, with UNICEF and Google, working to build a predictive model for the spread of Zika virus by using not only rainfall data, but also human mobility information in real time from mobile phone networks. Looking at how people are displaced by a natural disaster, floods, for example, in Mexico, by looking at mobile data, predicting food, extracting food prices from tweets, or understanding why parents don't want to vaccinate their children. In Indonesia, we've got a tool right now that leverages our partnership with Twitter. SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 13, is why we're here today in particular, and that's really looking at the opportunities around climate. You're aware we have this challenge at dataforclimateaction.org. I would just say the opportunity here for us is really exciting because it's not just about bringing new data sources as evidence of climate change and new algorithms to help improve modeling. It's also incredibly important about climate action. Getting to Paris required really good evidence of climate change, but understanding how we're changing or failing to change how we interact with the climate system and what approaches convince people to change their lifestyle, right? This kind of thing is where we really think there's an amazing opportunity to begin to understand what works and what doesn't, so where we're not making those changes fast enough, we can take corrective action.
Robert touched upon hunger, poverty, and then he talked about sustainability. So today, just from the data shows us, 120 people commit suicide, Americans, every day. That is a total of 55,000 people, roughly, Americans, committing suicide. For 50 years, we did research. Researchers, very, very smart people did research how to prevent these suicides. And we were not able to make any real progress. But in the last year, with data science and machine learning, we are able to predict accurately for 2 years in advance that a suicide will happen with 80% accuracy. So let's ask the question, why now? And how did it happen, right? So what's happened now is we have overcome the traditional risk factors. So if you look at the traditional risk factors, they are related to stress, they are related to substance abuse, they are related to a person having depression. And we try to make random guesses. Clinicians try to make random guesses based on those traditional risk factors. But modern data, with lots of data coming out of electronic records, we are able to look at things that correlate. We are able to look at signals, inter-signals between these. And we're able to predict with great deal of accuracy. This is a lot of work that was done by Florida State University and researchers making dramatic change in 50 years in the field of social good.
And I think this is a really important point. This issue of this illustration of how data science and machine learning and AI can help us really solve problems that we haven't solved before by seeing things that we can't see alone. And I think that's really important. When we are dealing with climate change, though, one thing that you have to recognize, and why I think it's so important to have the intersection of not just data science, but social science, biophysical scientists, and people making decisions on the ground, is that what data science can be very good at on its own is looking at sort of the hyper-local and the hyper-now, solving problems now. But when we're dealing with climate change, we really need to think about the context of long-term trends. And we need to develop policies that are going to influence those long-term trends. And I don't think we've cracked the nut yet about how data science can help intersect with the more traditional science approach to understanding those long-term trends. I think there's an intersection that can make a lot of change, but we haven't done that because from what I see is that there are these two separate threads. It's even true with the SDGs. In the SDG community, there's this community that's really deep in the data, doing great things, and there's this community that's in the science. And there is intersection of data and scientists, traditional scientists, but it's more often developing methods than actually solving societal problems. And that's where I think there's really an opportunity. And so to give a concrete example of that, which is really has become more top of mind these days because in the Paris Agreement, climate resilience was, for the first time, put on par with mitigation. And so climate resilience being the need to adapt, respond, adjust to those changes that are already underway and are unavoidable. One of the things that was required by that is there's this requirement for global stock taking, right? For all of the major components of, in the Paris Agreement, we have to come back and say, well, how have we done? And people need to make investments in climate resilience. And all of these things lead to the question of, well, how do we know if someone's resilient? How do we know if they're more resilient? How do we know where to invest our resilience? And last year I worked at the White House in the Obama administration, and during that time we had a meeting with Jim Kim exploring issues of climate and his climate investments. And one thing he said was, Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, and one thing he said to us was, well, I have all this money set aside for climate resilience investment, but I'm not sure how to invest it because I don't know which investment's going to make me more resilient and I can't track resilience. So on the one hand, this seems like a perfect data problem, measuring something. On the other hand, you have to understand what do you mean by resilience, in what case, in what context, and how is that going to be useful at a global policy level to advance the policy. I think this is a completely solvable problem, but you need the intersection of the folks working at the policy level, the data scientists, and the social and biophysical scientists thinking about this issue. Right now, how this is dealt with, or how it has been dealt with, is really thinking about a top-down approach. There's something called the Human Development Index, which is, various different metrics at a national scale that's then sort of plopped at the nation and say, this is some version of HDII+++, Human Development Index Plus, says now this place is vulnerable, this place is less vulnerable, this place is vulnerable. That was really helpful 15 years ago. Actually, I did my dissertation on this topic, so I'm very focused on this. I've been focused on this topic for years. And a long time ago, that was the model. But increasingly, we could move towards process-based model. And now, the difference what data science can let us do, before we had to go from the top down. Now we can scale metrics from the bottom up. We can have individualized metrics that we can operationalize at scale. I'm not sure how to do it, but I'm really convinced we can do it if we work at this intersection of traditional science, data science, and policy and active action. The biggest cap to making the change that we need to in the world is working together across sectors. There's the engine that is moving in each of these communities has to come together to define the problems, to sort of come up with solutions, and to do that in a way that isn't then shared with the person making the decision, but it's developed with that person to make the decision. And that's how we're going to actually make the change that we can do.
I think there's a gap in data also because we have to rethink our collection methods. The data we collect is kind of biased, and so we got to start thinking about how do we collect unbiased data. So in the example of the suicidal case where, Amy was talking about measuring, right? We couldn't measure in the last 50 years whether we made positive impact. Now with machine learning, we have actually a model, and we can measure the model and the output of the model and what the clinicians are doing, how many suicidal attempts we actually averted. Now, note that there was a data point which showed that all of these people who committed suicide in a year actually visited a physician in that 1 year before they committed suicide, and the physician had no clue that this person who's sitting in front of me, whom I'm giving guidance, is about to commit suicide. Today we can empower those clinicians and we can measure the data. We have infrastructure, that's a big gap for us. As Amy said, the scaling part, right? We are not able to scale because we need infrastructure where we can actually collect massive amounts of data, mine massive amounts of data, anonymize that data, take the personally identifiable information out, and then look at the data for the results.
I mean, in a dearth of having that unbiased collection of data, I know that there is sort of a need for a private donation of data, essentially. And maybe Robert, you can speak to this a little bit. Just how would donating data work, and what? I guess, what is the method and what are you looking for?
Well, we set out this project in 2010 and realized, okay, we can't do this without all of the data that's already out there being passively generated. Well, how do we get access to it? Lots of questions arise. You want access to insights, but there are privacy issues and there are competitiveness issues around that data being shared. So we started talking about what we call data philanthropy back in 2011, and sort of approaching companies in different sort of priority industries. So retail and e-commerce, the mobile industry, financial institutions, social media companies, and saying, look, let's find a way for you to share some of the data that powers your business in a way that protects privacy fully, in a way that processes the data such that it wouldn't be of any use to your competitors, but can still provide insights that can be used to improve outcomes for people around the world. It took off pretty quickly. Companies got very excited about this for reasons that, some reasons were pretty sort of clear why, but then there were some surprises along the way. I mean, it's a new kind of, data philanthropy is a new kind of corporate social responsibility strategy where you're giving away information rather than, say, shareholder dollars, right? But it turns out that when you're taking, the brightest, say, 1 or 2% of the population, and having them click on ads, or get people to click on ads all day is a major focus of their work, that's kind of soul-killing and kind of meaningless. And if you can give them a chance to volunteer 10 or 20% of their time for something that is really, really going to have an impact, and they can actually make sure that it has an impact because they're part of the project team that's doing this. They're collaborating with the UN, with the World Food Program and UNICEF to make sure that it has an impact. There's a lot of motivation that comes out of that. So that was, there's kind of a morale piece to it. But then it turned out, so I'll take you an example. So we did a project a couple of years ago in Rwanda where we got 7,000 household surveys on how much money people spent on food. And we then got 40 million de-identified records of airtime purchases, people buying, topping off their mobile phones with credit, $1, $5, $10. We got a 0.89 Pearson correlation between food consumption and airtime consumption, right? So that's interesting, because that means every mobile operator in the world is running a sort of food security monitoring network without even knowing it. Now, if you're a mobile operator in, in East Africa and you have spent $1 million putting tower infrastructure into, rural areas, you're counting on people subscribing to your sports scores and your weather updates and your news to monetize that investment. And then there's a drought, and these people have to sell their assets. They're struggling to feed their families. Maybe they leave the area. They're going to unsubscribe from your services. But guess what? There were behavioral changes that started showing up 4 months earlier in your data warehouse you didn't even know to look for. They could have been used by the World Food Program to implement school feeding programs. People didn't have to pull their kids out of school to work in the markets. It could have been used by the UN Development Program for mobile money-based cash transfers to help people coast through that drought. Right? So you've created business risk by not finding a way for the insights that are in your data to be used to shape policy that protects your customers. And I think that's sort of unexpected, but we actually see a lot of businesses, particularly in emerging markets, who really see that opportunity. Poverty, hunger, and disease are bad for business, and it turns out that the real-time insights from human behavior in those populations are often the best source of information to be used to help make sure that they do well. So data philanthropy is taking off now. It's a movement. There's a lot of interest in companies in different industries, and say just the mobile industry recently announced in Mobile World Congress this year that they're committed to a data for good strategy around the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have now, growing partnerships with financial institutions and retail and e-commerce companies and social media companies who are doing the same. So there are huge opportunities here.
I come from a data science background, so for me, data itself is very neutral, right? What you see in the data is very neutral. How you interpret that data, the behavior around that data is more important than what you actually see in the data. In the private sector, we pay a lot of attention on privacy, so we anonymize all the data. We take out personally identifiable information. But beyond that, we are working towards providing a lot of transparency with the data and how the models are built and why it's built and what's the starting point. We are transparent with the data all the way to the collection point. Authentication and authorization is very key. So this is an area of ongoing work. I don't think it's finished anywhere close, right? But I think authentication, authorization, trying to form a lineage of who comes from where, we are able to track what the criminals are doing with the data.
Yeah. So if you are a data scientist and you're working at your job, how can you advocate for public interest access?
We've been looking at this for a while at the United Nations because we have, just in Global Pulse, we have 3 data science labs in Uganda, Indonesia, New York. UNICEF, World Food Program, UNDP are all building data science teams now. And UN's in a kind of unique position because on the one hand, we have a global mandate to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to drive humanitarian action around the world. At the same time, we have a mandate to protect human rights, of which privacy is one. And so there's a sense in which we cannot not figure out how to use this data, but we also have to make sure we're taking a first do no harm approach. As we look at the landscape of privacy laws around the world today, this isn't working, right? I mean, on the one hand, these data sources are incredibly difficult to reliably anonymize. Yay, I took out all personally identifiable information from the data set. Okay, but, and you all know this, like how you search, how you move, the patterns of your transactions over time or communications are as unique to you as your fingerprint, right? So, and that's just when you're looking at a single data set, right? So it's very, very difficult to, especially when you can combine these data sets, there are huge privacy risks that come with big data that haven't yet been adequately addressed by existing privacy regulations. So huge risk of misuse, and then you have this perhaps even bigger problem, which is the risk of non-use, right? Because access to food and water and shelter and education and healthcare are also human rights. And it turns out that the fact that this information for years has been generated by people just by walking around with mobile devices in their pocket, just by interacting with sensor networks, without their knowledge, could have been used to improve early warning systems and disaster response, improve healthcare, improve the justice system, improve the education, and it hasn't been. That's a real problem, and it's an unrecognized problem. There's this invisible opportunity gap that people don't realize even exists, that we've been paying in our societies from rich to poor all around the world. And I think that sort of now we're looking at, so we have a problem of misuse, and we have a problem of misuse, of non-use. So we need to change privacy policies around the world to say this isn't just about privacy, right? This is about making sure that when data can be misused, it isn't, and that when data can be used for good, it can be guaranteed to be used for good in a safe and responsible way. And that means we need to begin to understand, the relationship between privacy and utility. Like, what's an acceptable risk of re-identification in a communications data set? Is it 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million? It's like, well, maybe the answer is another question. What's the mortality rate of the disease we're trying to stop? If we could begin to have a kind of quantitative view of this and understand a way to manage risk on both sides of that, both ends of that spectrum, I think it's going to be if we can't do that, I don't know how we'll be able to achieve these goals, because we can't achieve them without all of these insights. But we've got to do it in a way that doesn't place people in harm's way as a consequence. To follow on this question, I mean, if you're interested in doing this within your company, those of you who are data scientists who work with these data sources, I mean, you know the kinds of data that you have. You've got to be able to make the case for it, first of all. It may be the kind of data you have only you or people in your organization know has potential value. We often interact with companies who are sitting on data, and we see what they've got, and we say, oh my God, this is incredible. And people don't even realize it. I mean, Aristotle said you cannot be a philosopher, and by that he meant what we would call a scientist as well, unless you have a sense of wonder. And that means making things a bit strange to yourself. You've got to step out of your normal use cases and think about, how would my data change if people lost their jobs, or if they got sick, or if there were a disaster? What patterns would show up in that data, and how could we use it? I don't think this is all about philanthropy in the long-term sense. This is about building a resilient society, and that requires a sustainability model. Find a business case where if you can provide that information, it can deliver value such that public sector would be willing to pay for it, but it could save lives, improve justice or equality or health of people. I don't think you have to necessarily say it's just about the disaster where you're giving away data to save lives in an emergency. It's also about reducing carbon emissions, and there are all sorts of things you can do. If you look at our Data for Climate Action Challenge, we've got a number of companies who've signed up for it. And the kinds of data that they have are just incredible. The mobile operator Orange has provided a data set, for example, that is the levels of interference between cell towers. And you're thinking, why is that interesting? So it turns out when it rains, the towers have to boost the signal with the microwave shots, right, to keep the towers talking to each other and make sure everybody gets a good link. So that means every mobile phone network in the world could potentially have a built-in flash flood early warning system, right? The cell towers have solar panels, right, that collect the energy output every 6 seconds. They delete this data every day, but you could use that to predict crop yields, because you could tell, are the crops getting enough sun, and that could have a business model, right? Potentially validating insurance claims for farmers. Right? You have to look at what you have and look at it as a stranger a bit. And I think some of the data sets, take a look at dataforclimateaction.org. You can see some of these kinds of data. But I think be creative, step outside your own skin for a bit, brainstorm with some friends. And if you're interested in doing some of this work, we and others we know would be very interested in talking to you.
Yeah, I guess just from a layperson's perspective, is this something that that if you work for a sort of a public sector company or an NGO, do you have consultants that can work with companies on that? I guess it's something from someone who's outside just doesn't know. Does this need to be consulted?
Public sector institutions are starting to explore this.
Yeah.
This is a case where actually the United Nations is really thinking about this pretty actively. I can name 4 or 5 agencies you could go to and say, well, if you said we have this kind of data, you would have organizations that wanted to work with you. I mean, we have whole teams that work with companies to design and implement projects together with them.
So just to look a little bit forward now, this is a question open for all of you. What do you all predict for the future of data science? I mean, I know that's a very broad question, but are you hopeful? Are you skeptical? Are you cautiously hopeful? I mean, I assume you're all here because you're hopeful, but is there caution? Is there anything to be worried or look forward for?
All right, I'll start this question. I'm going to give you 3 things as trends to take away. One trend we are seeing that's coming together, and again, I'll give you a little bit of history. When I was at Yahoo, I was looking at numbers, unique visitors coming to Yahoo, and this number, right? And I was also watching Facebook's unique visitors, and I called something the tipping point is something we really have to worry about, right? When the tipping point, when it crosses the tipping point, you know that you're in danger because the signal is strong, and something's racing forward, leaving the other things behind. So one tipping point that has happened in the industry is in the financial industry, and this is with gender inequality and investing, right? So female investors, right? I don't know if you guys have seen the numbers. In the US, $14 trillion personal investing, tipping point, women have gone to 51% of that. 51% already tipped. That means in 2020, women, 22 trillion will be done by women investors. One trend to watch out for, very powerful trend. Now, women entrepreneurship, micro trends, and also women with purchasing, right? Largest economy, women for marketing. They make all purchasing decisions, everyday purchasing decisions, groceries, things like that. They're also very influential in buying car, buying a home, buying appliances. So the purchasing decisions are shifting. Now let's go to energy and climate change. In the energy area, I'm going to give you 2 examples. One is beer. You all love beer, right? When you brew beer, there's a lot of waste. That waste can be converted to energy, electricity, right? You can turn that through turbines, and we are seeing we can create very good electricity with that. So that's one area where some of the investments are going to create good energy. Second area is around hurricanes and tornadoes. These things create enough electricity for an entire year of usage of electricity. So now a researcher in Canada is actually, Louise, he's actually creating artificial tornadoes stationary. Warm, moist air going up and coming down and creating electricity through turbines. Extremely interesting work that will take us very far-reaching impacts into the future.
I mean, if you don't work in global development unless you're an optimist by nature. I think at the same time, the news out about climate, and particularly this week, is not good. I think the open innovation models that we've seen, that the Data for Climate Action is an example of, Kaggle and so forth. I mean, these kinds of models are really, really going to continue. Data for Climate Action is sort of our first pass at this in the UN. We got like about 100 teams competing. We got almost 10 companies involved providing data sets. I think what we'd love to see is this work continue, right? Because the amazing thing about these kinds of challenges is that you advance development of every part of the journey to creating this kind of innovation ecosystem that you need. In the process of doing this, companies learn what data they have that's relevant, and they figure out what's involved from a legal standpoint to share it. The public learns that the data that they're producing is actually relevant for protecting the planet and their communities. Data scientists find opportunities to develop, to do entirely new kinds of work. I mean, our hope is really that we'll see an entire sort of explosion in academia looking at these kinds of public good-oriented applications. It's been led by industry, but I think it's clear that there are huge opportunities and huge needs for innovation. So our hope and belief is that this is really going to take off. There's a very key point, though, that, we look at sort of why this isn't already the way the world works, right? We talk to privacy regulators, we talk to companies. The companies say, well, we'd love to share all the data, but in some industries they say we're not allowed to share it because of privacy regulations. If it's a natural disaster, then privacy goes out the window. Otherwise, nobody can come within a 3-kilometer radius of the data. That's not a great starting point for innovation. You talk to the privacy regulators, and they say, no, we get it. It's actually an ethical issue that the data is not being used. But we're not getting this from political leaders. They're not putting pressure on us to change this because they don't even understand how they could transform the services that they provide to populations. Well, political leaders aren't going to do that until their constituents come to them and say, this is not okay, right? It's not okay that we're not benefiting in ways that we should be. And so I think there's a real need for sort of educating the public and advocating for making sure that this data is used and making sure that investment in data science happens so that we can figure out what the methodologies are. And really engaging with companies to make them aware of the value of the data they have and creating a new relationship between them and their own customers around that data. There's public goods here, but they won't be realized until the people say it's time.
So I'll take the question as whether I'm optimistic about climate rather than on data per se. But and similarly with global development, you do have to be optimistic in working on climate. And I have worked on this issue for about 20 years. And I remain optimistic, although I will confess I have gone up and down over the years. And it's true, there is a lot of news out recently that maybe is a lot of reason not to be optimistic. But the important thing to remember is that while there are a lot of projections out there that say it's going to be tough to make the 2-degree threshold of 2 degrees warming above pre-industrial, which is a threshold that was established by the Paris Agreement or previously by the UN process as dangerous level of climate change. What's important to remember is that none of those projections take into consideration the possibility that there is a dramatic action that's taken in policy by the people. And this is the issue of scale. Now, these are the kinds of things that this type of community, working together with scientists, working together with the policies, that we need to shoot for. We need to go beyond those projections that say we can't do it. And this kind of community knows how to do that, knows how to be told we can't do it and just saying, yes, we can. And that's what we need to do. Having said that, as we shoot for trying to reach a 2-degree target, we also have to prepare for not reaching it. And there's a lot of opportunities for innovation in that space that we really need to focus on, and that has to be a both and in that context. And I wanted to make one comment in this context of optimism relative to the private data question we had earlier, and that is, remember that there's a huge amount of new opportunity in data science, connecting with sort of more traditional scientists, if you will, where I come from, and policy that is not an issue of privacy. So for example, one thing that I think will be transformative is there's this new company called Saildrone. I don't know if many of you know this, which is sending these little tiny boats all over the ocean and tracking, measuring temperature and lots of other data as well. This could transform how we make projections of weather. This could transform how we manage not just the ocean, but the whole system, because the ocean controls so much of what makes the air we breathe, the water we drink, the climates that we live in. Using those data in a way that can develop new ways of managing our systems is going to be really transformative. And it's things like that that I see that I think, wow, we really could make a big change here if we work together.
If you guys have a question, just raise your hand, and we have a mic, I think, to come around.
Here's a specific one that can be broader, which is, you said suicides, there are like 55,000, right? and you said that this data can tell you, 80%, predict 80% of that. So the implication is that 44,000 people are now being prevented from suicide. And you said that progress this year was greater than the last 50 years. So my question is that true? Has this data actually prevented 44,000 suicides per year? Even in the year of progress, can you, with confidence, say that that progress is going to be sustainable? Have you, simply delayed suicides? And the reason why I ask is because risk factors for suicide, like you said, substance abuse, so on and so forth, I think that those are really deep challenges. I think it's really difficult to actually, change some of that stuff. So how do you actually know that data is going to solve the problem? And the broader question is for climate. And the reason why I'm skeptical is because every so often you hear people say, oh, it's partnerships, or it's policy, or it's tech, and this is going to solve, poverty or healthcare or whatever, or climate change, and that hasn't happened. So why is data different? How is data going to actually solve the problem?
So for 50 years, very, very smart people measured and found there was no positive change we made. Now with data science, what has happened is we've got more data, we've got more transparency, we've got strong signals. In the first year, when they measured, they actually saw massive change, right? That's how the measurement came. 80% was able to be changed. Is it sustainable? This is a long-term question. Data science is not a one-time size-fits-all type of thing. It's an iterative effort, right? We work together to iterate over and over again. But what we've found was additional research around this that was helping the crisis line. So when people text into the crisis line, they're usually using words in their text that can put a risk score. Now, we already assign risk scores when a patient comes in. Cardiovascular risk score. We assign a suicidal risk score to people going to general hospital. Right? This work is not complete, but to me it's very promising because we allowed 45,000 people to die when we could have given them help. Right? Now we have data that we can make available to clinicians who have vowed to do good, right, to save lives. And now we have something to help that. So it's a step in the positive direction, and we have to embrace these small steps in the positive direction to get to the greater good, right? There will be a price to pay along the way. One of the things Robert talked about was it's going to be noisy, it's going to be not pretty, there's going to be cases where we actually killed somebody with all this information, right? That's the price to pay. But we have to advance with as little signals as we got in the forward direction.
Just briefly, when you talk about sort of the more general problem of, okay, so we produce more evidence and people are already not making evidence-based policy decisions, so why is this going to drive institutional change, right? Fundamental question. I think I look at some of the new opportunities here as necessary and sufficient, of course, but there's an accountability dimension to these new data sources that you don't get with the more traditional data, right? Everybody saw it 15 years ago, okay, government has all the data, people don't have data, let's start an open data movement, let's get the data out there. And it matters, but it's an accountability tool, but like how actionable for the average person is 3-year-old data that shows the failure of the previous administration's policy, right? Being able to see within 3 hours after a natural disaster that an ethnic minority is not receiving the same level of government assistance as everybody else, okay, so the real-time thing is actually a qualitative difference, it's not just a quantitative difference. The accountability dimensions of this information and the fact that it's not collected and owned by government, but it's actually produced directly by people and owned by private sector, and government can't stop its being collected, creates a kind of new potential for at least making the excuse we didn't know disappear from the known universe. That doesn't guarantee action, but it could, in the right hands, be used as a political force.
It's been a riveting conversation. I'm curious specifically in civic tech and the rise of civic engagement, and within that niche, how you foresee that data playing on climate change, and more specifically, how?
One of the challenges with climate, why we have these, if you've seen a projection of the different trends, there's a huge variation, right? There's a huge gap between the low end and the high end, and recent research that just came out this week suggests that the sort of more optimistic ends are probably not that likely. But one of the things that's really important to remember, I wish I had the graph in front of me, in that range of projections of where the temperature could go, a huge part of that range is what we do. So the reason there's a range is because we can't predict what we do very well. And so this gets to your question, is once we have more information about what people do and why they do it, then we can make those models in a more effective way. But I want to come back to the question that was raised in the back of the room, because this is related. Data can help you do that. And just like I think this issue of the suicide, my reaction to that is to say, what that information did is provided more information to solve this problem, and we can now think about the problem and solve it in a new way. That by itself isn't going to solve the problem. Similarly, like this data, it's not going to solve the problem of how we're going to project this piece, but if we sit down together and the people who are making those scenarios are now have a different group of people saying, this is what we know. This is what the scenarios would be. That's the transformation.
On your mobile phone, you can turn on or off location services, right? Let's say you turned on location services. Now we can monitor how you move through different parking lots if you're doing retail purchases, right? And so transportation can actually predict traffic. This comes back to emissions, right? And they can use that for good. So there's a lot of participatory role that all of us have in this room to what data we provide. And mobile is a very upcoming area with a lot of data.
Yeah, I mean, for us, Global Pulse, certainly the kind of the end goal of this is not the UN and public sector institutions having access to better data. At the end of the day, you look at it as kind of a last mile problem, but it's actually getting the insights down to the community level. It's a data literacy problem there, of course, particularly in developing countries. But I think at the end of the day, this is really about making sure that there are lots of kinds of information that can be publicly shared. So, I mean, the idea, the name Global Pulse came from this idea of sort of measuring human well-being in real time, and imagining that there's sort of one day there'll be kind of baseline information available to the whole world on how people move, the social graph of the planet, spending in different categories, and that information could be used by activists at the community level, by city planners, ordinary citizens to accomplish a variety of tasks. Imagine today if we could find you get a kind of legal and cultural and technical architecture that would allow us to see for every community on Earth where people are in transitioning from buying, rainforest mahogany wood furniture to bamboo furniture, or from incandescent lighting to LED lighting, upgrading old inefficient machines versus transitioning to new ones. That's something we could do today, right? The information's out there, but it's going to take people at the community level mobilizing, and it's not just a data science problem, it's also building trust with business and everybody working together and make sure the privacy issues are addressed.
With regards to the climate science aspect of this data modeling and the predictive nature of hard sciences, are there any particular trends that you see in different global climate models that are being used for specific languages and data sets and analytic tools, or hydrology models and different airflow models and environmental physical science models specifically, and what programs do they lend themselves to?
There was a show recently on PBS called The Crowd in the Cloud, and they talked about a lot of these kind of public apps where the public could enter information. Like, for instance, they had something in Spain where people were seeing areas of water where mosquitoes could breed for Zika. And I was wondering if there's kind of any focus on that type of issue and thing where people, the public can get into these types of events.
I'm not a climate modeler. I am a global environmental change scientist that's worked on climate, so I don't know the details of the models. But I'll answer your question in perhaps not quite the way you asked, but I think it's relevant to this crowd. One of the things that is really relevant, before I sort of switched to global environmental change, I actually worked I was an engineer and did hydrology and did flood maps and worked with drinking water systems and so forth. And one of the things that's really transformed in this space, which is a modeling component, I don't know if anybody's done flood mapping, but I did most of the flood mapping for the counties in California for like 30 years ago. And what we did then was we had this app. This app wasn't called an app. We didn't have apps back then. We had a computer model called the sort of engineer version of it was called HEC-RAS, and you'd look up data, and you had to be an engineer to use it, but basically you looked up data, you plugged it into this black box, which was a modeled water through the watershed, and then ran it through the river and told you where you were going to flood. And this is still really, really valuable, and it's used all over the world, right? Or not that specific model, but certainly used with the S. But what data science has done has begun to transform how we can actually model floods. So now we can look at, it rained, we know where it flooded because we have satellite imagery that tells us where it did. And now we can look at the correlation and said, okay, if it rains here, then it's going to flood here. So that process of how we can actually model flooding has changed. Now, that's not something that's operational everywhere in the world, but I will guarantee you that 10 years from now, it will be a lot of the places in the world. As a scientist, I don't guarantee much, so that's why I've made it a little bit fuzzy. But things are changing. How we model things are changing. The key thing there, though, again, gets back to this point that I raised earlier. It's this issue that what data science is really good at is hyper-local, hyper-now. But climate change is not just about that. So this is why, again, I'm a broken record, but it's really important. To solve big issues where data science can have a huge impact, transformative impact, you have to work with communities that think about the more traditional scientific community that thinks about these long-term change, both biophysical and social, and the policymakers that say, when you work together, is that solution actually something that's valuable that can help move society in taking action? And that gets to your point about disease and water and the connections of environment, and that's something I had worked on information systems and environment and health when I was at Google. And I think that was even 7 years ago or something, where there was a real a beginning of a rise in that area of how to operationalize these sorts of tools where it's not just centered in a center at a university, but actually not only make them operational in health centers, but actually make them more operational in community groups. And I think that there's a big trend, and I would venture to say again, 10 years from now, some of those things will become commonplace. The question that we have, the people in this room and the communities that we work with, it's only going to be that way in an effective way if we work together and we make it happen.
I'll add that, if you could think back about 5 years ago, I worked on Google Maps, and before Google Maps, there was Magellan and all those things, and if you looked at pathfinding, it was only about 70% accurate, right? User-defined data showed up, and the users made the map what it is today, right? It's very, very powerful because people can tell you, including traffic data right now, many of the traffic data, near real-time data, actually comes from the users, right? Restaurant data, you go into a restaurant, there's reviews. Now, some of this is biased because people like different food and so on and so forth, but users contribute to this data and making it rich, right? So user-defined data is really useful in so many areas than one, right?
Yeah, just on the second question, I think, this isn't just about sort of passively observing human behavior human communities in terms of their effect on the climate. I think citizen science and citizen reporting have a huge role to play here. And I think that when you actually look at most sort of end-to-end solutions, where we start to say, okay, we can actually solve the problem and drive change, you can have a combination of sensor networks, whether those are physical sensors or digital services that function as sensors. That data combined with, citizen reporting. This could be anything from biodiversity tracking to people alerting, to unusual things happening. I think that at the end of the day, you've got to combine, as they say, the wisdom of the crowd, the insight of the expert, the power of algorithms together. combining it and actually turning that into action is probably going to take some serious AI, though. Right? At some point, you're dealing with serious complexity, but we need to create more opportunities for people, to be able to share what they're observing, and make sure that we advance the state of the art and actually turning that information into something useful when it's combined with the more traditional data sources.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to our guests here, and I also want to thank UN Global Pulse, the Skoll Global Threats Fund, and Western Digital. I also want to remind you that there are still drinks in the back, and you're allowed to hang out for a time, I'm sure. Probably not as long as you want. You can't sleep here, I don't think, so you can. Yeah, thank you everybody.